Wireless mic tonight. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Good. We're going to get the lights. That'll be better. Okay, let's see if this will focus. Never pointed. Well, thank you for coming tonight. A couple of years ago, I became interested in how Sour Creek got its name. 31. That Sam Strickland and others started to settle in the north of Douro. However, if you look at the earliest map of Douro that we have, and I don't know if any of you have seen this before, I found it for the first time in the Archives of Ontario a number of years ago. But anyway, here, this is a map. It's a copy of Richard Birdsall's original survey, and it was made in August 1825 by the Surveyor General's office, and it was given to the Honorable Peter Robinson in order to show him what land was available to settle the Irish settlers. So it looks pretty full, as you can see. It was. So to begin with, in 1822, Stewart and Reed, they had been allowed to settle in the southwest corner of the unsurveyed township of Douro, and they each got 1,200 acres of land, and it's shown in yellow on that map. But after they'd been there for a short time, in 1823, they asked the government to reserve 10,000 acres of land for relatives and friends that they hoped to bring over from Ireland. And the government assigned them all the land that's encircled in red there, which is the bottom part of Douro. The top is the 10th line, approximately Center Road today. But there was a condition, and that was that their relatives and friends had to actually arrive and petition for particular lots within 3 years. Otherwise, they would lose the land. Well, of course, Stewart and Reed were relatively unsuccessful in encouraging people to come back quickly, so that by the time the Peter Robinson settlers arrived, they were happy to, it was almost 3 years were up, and so they were happy to give up their land in order for the Irish settlers to settle. And that's why all of them initially were settled below the 10th line. Because as you can see, the rest of Douro was already assigned to some extent. Now, what our history books don't tell you anything about is that there was another reserve just above this. Now, Alexander Davidson was a well-connected gentleman from Northern Ireland who had arrived in Upper Canada also in 1822. Now, after talking to Thomas Stewart, he petitioned the government for a 2,000-acre reserve north of the Stewarts, bounded by the river on the west, and to provide 400 acres each for himself and 4 other family members, 2,000 acres. The reserve was received in 1823, as shown outlined in blue on there. It was between the 10th line and the 14th line, with the river on the west and Fort Concession on the right. Now, Davidson's brother Samuel and another man named Richard Collins joined Alexander in 1823, and they began performing settlement duties on the lands. They've been assigned, and of course, the particular lands they've been assigned are shown in yellow here. In particular, this is Lot 13 in concessions 8 and 7 and 8, and then there's a couple of others down here. And this one in particular is important to our story because it's the lot, the pair of lots that Sawyers Creek runs through. Birdsall did all his surveying in the wintertime because you could walk over the swamps and there were no leaves on the trees and so on. So he charted the course of rivers by depressions and things, and he originally drew Sawyers Creek coming down here on the map, but in fact, on modern maps, it's actually up there. Now, if you look at the land records for this area, it shows that the Davidsons received the patents for their land in late 1826 and early 1827. They were the first two patents or deeds given for land in the township of Durrow. And only 10 days after they received the patents, they sold their lands to a Port Hope speculator named John Tucker Williams. And we can only speculate as to what happened. What we do know is that Alexander Davidson was a Wesleyan Methodist lay preacher and teacher. And in fact, he had founded one of the first schools in the area, which is known as the Cavan and Monaghan School. He was staying with a friend in Monaghan whilst a lot of this was going on. He was waiting for a receptive flock to arrive in Durrow. And when he was surrounded by Southern Irish Catholics, we assume he decided to pack up and get out, and that's what they did. So their only legacy of interest here was that they left a number of parcels of privately owned land, probably with houses on them, that were in Durrow fronting on the Otonabee River. And in the early 1830s, all this land was purchased by a man named Walter Crawford. Now, I don't know if there are any Crawford descendants in the audience tonight. There are, okay. Then I'm very pleased about that, and I'd love to speak to you afterwards, but we'll carry on and you'll find out more. So Walter Crawford, he was a very wealthy man. He was born in Ballyevie House in Banbridge, Northern Ireland, County Down, Northern Ireland. And he was the oldest son of a very successful linen manufacturer. And he inherited the house and the business in 1817. For whatever reason, it may be because he knew Thomas Stewart, and Thomas Stewart had been trying to encourage him to go out. There are connections with Stewart later on. It may be that he was one, but anyway, he decided to sell his business and his house and to move to Upper Canada. And so he put his business up for sale in 1827, and the property and his business was bought by other family members. And the Crawford linen business thrived and continued to be a very successful business for another 100 years in Ireland. But Walter came to, first of all, to Coburg. Now, in Coburg, within a few years, Crawford had bought a 243-acre farm just outside Coburg. It was ideally situated at the junction of the Danforth Road, the main road between York and Kingston, in one direction, and it was on the Coburg to Gore's Landing Road in the other. So he picked a perfect lot there. After a few years, Walter Crawford's interest turned to Peterborough, and he sold the farm, which was called Springvale, to his son, Alexander Crawford, Angus Crawford, and this farm will appear later on in our talk. You can see down below, this is how it looks today on an aerial survey, and Springvale House, if you go by it, it's a very grand house, white picket fence along the front, and it's in the woods there. Certainly not the way it was in 1830, but it has stayed together with the farm very well. So, one of the first properties that Walter Crawford purchased near Peterborough in April 1832 was this 13-acre piece of property in Smith Township, bounded by the Otonabee River on the east, and the town of Peterborough, Smith Street, which is now Park Hill Road, on the west, or on the south rather. This he intended to use as a lumber yard. Now this property right today, in here, this is a park called Ivy Lee, I believe, and Ivy Lee, after Walter Crawford's lumber yard, this property was purchased by Judge Dennis Toon, and he had a great country estate here and a very large house. But back in the early days, Crawford bought this for his lumber yard. And why? Well, here's an ad from the Coburg Star, 10th of May, 1833. Walter Crawford, Duro Mills, after having surmounted numerous difficulties, Walter Crawford had rafted a large quantity of lumber to Peterborough from his Duro Mills and had established a lumber yard there. So that kind of begs the question, where were Walter Crawford's Duro Mills? So, at about the same time, Walter Crawford began purchasing many properties in Smith and Duro townships. Most were broken waterfront lots along the Otonabee River and Lake Cachwanuka. Crawford must have heard about the speculation about opening the Trent and the Otonabee rivers for navigation, and he was hoping for increased property values, presumably. Two of the Duro properties along the river were, of course, the Davidson properties here, the one that Sawers Creek goes through, and the one below. He also bought, this was a clergy reserve, which he had his name on, but it was never actually, the land records don't show it as being purchased, but when they went to sell it in the 1860s, one of the Crawfords had to sign for it, so he seemed to own that too. But of course, one of the properties he bought in Smith is up here, Smith Lot 28, Concession 8, where Hague's Point is located. Now, Walter Crawford and a number of his family moved to Duro in the 1830s. I'm not sure exactly when. The ad said he had his mills there in 1831, but he was a wealthy man. He did not put the shovel in the ground to build them. He obviously paid somebody to build the mills there. But he did move up to Duro sometime after that, and with his family, and I believe that they settled on the properties around Sawers Creek. Samuel Strickland, in his books, 27 Years in Canada West, said that Colonel Crawford was was for many years one of my nearest and best neighbors. And Susanna Moody, in many of her letters to her husband between 1835 and 1838 and 39, he was in Coburg, he'd become the sheriff there. She was still on the farm up north of here. And she writes about Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, their son George Crawford, and their daughter and son-in-law, Mary and James Hague. Also Thomas Poole, in his history of Peterborough, written many years ago, he talks about how when the rebellion, 1837 rebellion occurred, 800 loyal militiamen descended on Peterborough and about 350 of the most able were marched off to Toronto, and the remainder of the battalion were left on a reserve, as a reserve under the command of Colonel Crawford in Ashburnham. We know that Colonel Crawford was in fact Walter Crawford, because his son Angus, when he died, here's his tombstone, and it proudly claims that he is the son of Colonel Crawford. And of course, he was born in Ballyevie House before they moved. So Walter Crawford's career, well, late in 1831, Thomas Stewart of Douro, he wrote to the Upper Canada's Civil Secretary recommending Walter Crawford to be a Justice of Peace. So they knew each other even back then. By 1833, Crawford had been made a Justice of Peace, but in Hamilton Township, we're down near Cobur. So it suggests he was still there at that time. But shortly after, there's a record that he was continued to be a Justice of Peace up in Douro. So he must have moved in between 33 and 35, something like that. When he was in Douro, well, between 1831 and 1832, both Lieutenant Colonel Robert Brown of Peterborough and Peter Robinson, now of York, they both wrote letters recommending Walter Crawford be made a major of the 4th Northumberland Militia. And Crawford was a major at the time of the 1837 rebellion. Later on, he was appointed Lieutenant Colonel of the regiment in 1840. He moved to Peterborough about that time, 1841. In 1846, he resigned his commission as Colonel of the Militia and was appointed the government land agent in Peterborough. And he continued in that position for a great many years. He finally died in 1866 at the age of 86. In his obituary, it mentions that he built the first mill in Douro. So there's additional collaboration there. So just where did he live? Well, we know that he originally started off in Springvale, but we have letters. Whilst he was, once he became part of the militia, he wrote letters about the militia to the government. And in all the letters that he wrote, he gives his address as Douro Mills, as Douro Mills, Northumberland. So he's using that as his home address. And that there are a number of letters between about 1830, I think the earliest one is about 1836, something like that, and 42. Once he moves to Peterborough, for a year or two, he just gives his addresses Peterborough, and then he builds a house in Peterborough called Glenville, and it happened to be on Charlotte Creek, quite in the middle of town, and so the name Glenville seems to fit. It was valley in the town. Now, where was Crawford's Douro Mills? Well, another piece of information we have is Frances Stewart. In one of her letters in 1841, she writes that we dined with our kind friends the Wolseleys and drank tea with the Crawfords, who live about halfway. So that's halfway between the Wolseleys and the Stewarts down at the bottom. Now, of course, the Wolseleys, they bought the Trails farm. Thomas and Catherine Park Trails sold their farm in about 1839-40 to the Reverend Henry Wolseley, and of course their property is now sort of Tate Lane and Lakefield Public School. That's where the Trail farm originally was. Now, we also have the Douro assessment roll for 1839, a little hard to go by, but we have Walter Crawford here. We've got all his lots, and interestingly enough, we have sawmills, one. Walter Crawford has a sawmill on his property. Now, which property? Well, there's only one this column is uncultivated acres, and this column is cultivated acres. The only land with any cultivation on it is Lot 13, Concession 8, and that is the property through which Sellers Creek runs. So it seems very likely that the sawmill was probably on Sellers Creek. Now, it's just interesting to see some of the other names here. We have people near him, Moody, spelled with a Y, Thomas Trail with one L. But anyway, so the assessor may not have been able to write it, to spell correctly. But also down here we have James Hague, spelled differently, but that's James Hague. Interestingly, he doesn't have any land because, of course, he's living down on the property of Walter Crawford. But he has, there's two things to know. One, he has 6 cultivated acres or 6 cleared acres. But also over here, there's that one. Now, these are types of houses. The first one are log or hewn houses. And then there's another category of slightly better ones. But this category is framed houses. So it would appear that the assessor didn't bother putting down log houses because everyone had log houses then. But James Hague was different. He had a frame house, which suggested two things. One, he probably came a bit later than the others, and we know he did. I'll get to that in a moment. And also, he had already available sawn timber because he was living on a lot with a mill. So, shortly after Walter Crawford moved to Peterborough, or about that time, got to get on the right page. Okay, Walter Crawford and his wife moved to Peterborough sometime in about 1841. But prior to that, a number of their family members were living with the Douro. Now, he had a daughter named Mary Crawford, and she was born in Ireland in 1816. But in April 1837, Mary Crawford married James Hague at Springvale, the family farm down in Crawford. The records describe Hague as a gentleman rather than a farmer or a laborer. In particularly birth records in the church records of St. John's, when people had their children baptized, they put down whether they were a farmer, a laborer, or what. He was put down as a gentleman, so somewhat of money. But other than that, I know little more about him. I've recently found out that he was the son of Bernard Hague from York in England. So he was an Englishman, but apparently well off. So they had 2 children, both born in Douro, Eliza Georgina, born in 1838, and James, born in 1843. Now, and as I say, they almost certainly lived with the Crawford family down in this Sellers Creek area. We have some evidence of them from the writings of Susanna Moody. Pardon me? Mm-hmm. Who's living on that property now? I believe they're here. I believe, well, there's right near the creek, the Hickeys, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah. They're the closest, and then part of that lot is also owned by another family, they have a house right up on the hill above. But they're not related to any of these people as far as I know. I think they came later. Okay? Pardon? Yeah, but this is all, I believe I talked to a gentleman who said about 1850. We're talking about 1830s. Pardon? Yeah, well, okay. So back in when Susanna Moody, again, when she was writing letters to her husband Dunbar in 1839, she talks about 2 visits from Mary Hague. Susanna was very ill at the time. She just had a child, and I think she had real problems. And she had a couple of visits from Mary Hague, and Susanna, she brought Susanna old port wine and many fine things. And she took the Moody's daughter Agnes to live with her for the winter. So clearly the Hagues lived fairly nearby, and they appeared to be well off. Now, 1843 was not a good year for the Hagues. It started in March, at the end of March, when James Hague purchased Walter Crawford's land in Smith that included what is now Hague's Point. But in early May, James Hague and Hugh Nelson attempted to cross the river just below the falls in Lakefield, and both of them were drowned. So perhaps Hague was going to inspect the new land, we'll never know. But James Hague his death was recorded in the parish registry at St. John's Anglican Church in Peterborough. It was registered on May 28, 1843. He drowned a week or 2 earlier. It said he was 30 years old at the time, and it described him again as a gentleman of Durham. And his son, James Hague Jr., was born 2 months after his father's death. So what is a widow to do with 2 young children? Well, she has to find another husband. So enter Augustus Sawers. So Augustus Sawers was born in Scotland in 1819, and his father was a lieutenant in the Royal Marines. His mother was reputed to be the daughter of William Campbell, a commissioner of the Navy Board, now called the Admiralty. But this has not been confirmed. It does appear that the Sawers had money from what went on later. Now, his father, John Sawers, was also a native of Scotland. He joined the Royal Marines in 1804, served for 28 years, and in 1832, a lieutenant on half pay, he immigrated to Upper Canada, and he acquired a large tract of land in Verulin Township near Boccagen, something like 1,308 acres of land, and pushing the wrong button. It's in here. It included the back end of the Boccagen Island. So the lock, which was actually being built at the time, 1833, they started it, was right in this area, just over beyond them. So he had a large grant of land there. Well, most of what we know about John Sawers, other than land petitions, come from what was written by John and Anne Langton. And they were also early settlers in the Verulin area. Things did not go well for Sawers. In 1835, Anne Langton said that she was very comfortably accommodated at what was Mr. Sawers' house, which is now a tavern. We're also told that Sawers' son had died. This was not Augustus, it was another son that came with him at the time. And we do know that Verulam was very remote in those days, and within a few years, many of the early settlers had moved back to Peterborough, and it's probable that John Sawers did too, but we don't know. So meanwhile, Augustus Sawers was, as he said later, receiving what he called a liberal education through the schools of France and Germany. Again, an indication that his parents were fairly well off. In about 1840, at the age of 21, he came to Upper Canada to join his father, but we really know very little about what he did in the first 3 or 4 years that he was here. But in 1844, it would appear that we don't know how they met, but by mid-1844, it would appear that Mary Hague and Augustus Sawers were engaged. Because on July the 8th, 1844, John Sawers transferred all of his lands in both Verulam and St. Vincent townships to Augustus for natural love and affection, which is a term used in land records meaning a no-cost transfer between family members. Now, it could be that John Sawers was in ill health, but it seems more likely that he was endowing his son with property on his decision to marry. The next thing, 2 weeks later, Augustus Sawers and Walter Crawford drew up, but did not register, a pair of documents whereby Crawford gave Sawers his Duro Lot 13 concessions 7 and 8, through which Sawers Creek runs. And in exchange, Sawers gave Crawford an annuity of £25 per year for as long as Walter, his wife Eliza, and his son George lived. And these documents appear to constitute a marriage contract. Of course, then on October 1st, 1844, Augustus Sawers and Mary registered at St. John's Anglican Church in Peterborough, and a week later, the marriage contract documents were registered. So, for about 8 years, it would appear after they were married, it appeared Mary and Augustus lived on the Duro property, where they brought up the 2 Hague children from Mary's first marriage, and they also had 5 children of their own together. Although it's a very dark slide, so I'm actually having a little difficulty. Oh, this is a good light here. Yeah, although the history books suggest that Sawers built the mill on the creek, it seems much more likely that there was a mill on the creek, which was Walter Crawford's Duro mills, and that Augustus Sawers inherited that or bought that along with the property when he married Walter's daughter. So after a number of years, they decided they would move to Peterborough. But before we leave that, the question of where was Sawers Mill or Walter Crawford's mill? Well, it seems very likely. I put together what I think. With permission from the owner's son, I was allowed to take a walk through the property here, and there's a bridge that goes across the creek, and you can walk in this area. So when I did that, right across there, if you stand at the creek, there's an earthen berm that goes from the edge of the creek all the way to the road. That's the road the road you see here. And that looks to me like it's a dam. So I don't know for sure, but I think that the dam was here. The mill presumably was a bit before that. Of course, the water level in here now is much higher because of the TSW dam that was built years and years later. Now, if this was the dam, then, or a dam, then it would have created a small mill pond here. The creek runs down quite a narrow, long, narrow ravine, and there's 15 or 20 feet in elevation difference between the wetlands up here and the river down below. And so I think it's almost certain that they would have put a dam here. This mill pond doesn't have a lot of capacity. So you'd be great in first thing in spring, but after the spring freshet, you'd run out of water. But if you put a dam up here, you could flood the wetlands, and the wetlands are almost the same level all the way through Buckley Lake and well beyond. So by putting a dam here, you'd have almost an infinite supply of water that you could let down the creek in summertime to replenish the pond for milling. So it was kind of, so I think that there was a mill site there. I've not been able to go and look, and I doubt after 200 years I would see anything, but that seems to be reasonable. So what happened to the mill? Here's what Mrs. Aileen Young wrote through years in Douro, our centennial history of Douro. She says, back in the 1840s, the dam built by Sawyers, originally spelled Sawyer, clearly a lot of, anyway, it was blamed by the settlers for indirectly causing their frequent attacks of Hague, which is swamp fever. It's a type of malaria that was very prominent back in those days. They thought because the dam backed up the water, causing them to become stagnant, it was the cause of all their misery. The settlers finally became so distraught that they all rushed upon the dam one night and tore it down and let the water away. And that was the end of Sawyer's Mill, my Irish friend told me. So it seems, just going back one, it would make a lot of sense to me if all this land up here would be flooded, and a long way through Douro it would affect a lot of people. And once that dam was gone, it would perhaps take out the mill pond, but even after that, the dam wouldn't, the mill wouldn't be too functional. Now, of course, the other thing is that because the story has circulated among the local Irish community for 150 years, that explains all the different names. They didn't probably know or know how to spell his name back then, but they knew his name was Sawyers, and as the story was passed around over the years, when it was written down phonetically and came out in many different ways. So in the early 1850s, the Sawyers family decided to move to Peterborough. And it certainly seems that Augustus Sawyer's interests were much more business and politics and not farming. And he had all this land, still owned all this land up in Verulin Township. And so he was interested in any ways he could find to increase the value of his Verulin lands. So one of the first ventures that he undertook was that he formed a joint stock company with a number of other prominent businessmen in Peterborough, where they were going to construct a gravel road from Peterborough to Bobcaygeon. And they proposed, this proposal was going to include a bridge across Shamong and Bridgenorth. Well, both Peterborough, the town of Peterborough and the township of Ennismore were very keen on this idea. But in fact, a lot of farmers complained to their county councilors that it was going to cost them a lot of money and they didn't think they were going to benefit from it. So ultimately, the company failed before anything could be built. And it was another 16 years or so before the first floating bridge was constructed across Chemong at Bridgeland. His next venture was that he had a steamboat built on Chemong Lake called the Fly, and it provided passenger service on the upper lakes to Bridgenorth, Bocage, Fenwick Falls, Lindsay, we're told. And then in 1856, he purchased the Peterborough Dispatch newspaper, and he renamed it the Peterborough Examiner. And he was its first owner and editor. Later on, someone called it or described it as a fighting organ of the Reform Party. He did seem to be a supporter of the Reform Party. Anyway, in 1857, he tried to run for county, or he did run for county council against two other well-known Peterborough people. He came in with a very poor third. I think he got 17 votes, something like that. Anyway, now in 1858, he decided to run to be mayor of Peterborough for the following year. The Municipal Act at that time was changed. In former years, the mayor had been selected from among or elected by the councillors of the town, and the Municipal Act was changed to make it a direct election by the public. And SARS had very strong public support. So he threw his hat in the ring, but his opponents made legal arguments to suggest that the law didn't come into effect until the following election, the following year. So he didn't get elected in '59 or for the year '59, but in late '59 he was elected. His opposition realized they didn't have a chance, so they stood down, and he was elected by acclamation as mayor of Peterborough in 1860. Now, Peterborough was heavily in debt because they had invested heavily in getting the Peterborough to Millbrook link of the Port Hope, Lindsay, and Beaverton Railway, and that had opened in 1858. But the town put a lot of money into that. But anyway, Sawyer's pledges. First of all, he believed that the town had been, or the former council had been hoodwinking the public about expenses and how things were going on. So he pledged to put in place more publicly transparent accounting systems, ensure that all new work was done by tender and contract, and to abolish the favoritism. Things haven't changed too much, have they? Anyway, one of the highlights of his year in office was the visit of the Prince of Wales. I know where I am here. Anyway, the Prince of Wales came to town. Sorry. Yeah, well, it happened in September 1860, and the Prince arrived at Ashburnham by railway from Coburg, and he passed through Peterborough to the station of the Port Hope Railway, from which he left. And he stopped only a brief time at the courthouse, where Justice Sawyers and other dignitaries gave him speeches of welcome, but his visit to Peterborough lasted only about 1 hour. So, such as it was. However, Sawyers had been instrumental in organizing this visit. but it may also have been his demise. He died 9 months later on August 6, 1861, the age of 42. His obituary said he never had a good day of health since that visit. The cause of death was said to be kidney disease, and apparently it caused great suffering. So finally, Augustus Sawers, he appears to have been an able an enterprising young man who probably could have achieved a lot more had he not died so young. While the creek in Douro that bears his name may represent one of his less successful ventures, it memorializes a man who made significant contributions to the public in early Peterborough, and seems fitting, only fitting that we should remember the name of his creek correctly. So the official name is now Sawers Creek. So again, Mary Sawers, Mary Hague Sawers, Crawford Hague Sawers is a widow. And what is a widow to do with many young children? She has to find another husband, and that she did. She married a younger man, John White, who was a very successful businessman, the owner of White and Company Foundry and Machine Shop in Peterborough. He took her children under the wing, and they all got launched successfully in various careers in business. So what happened to Mary and James Hague's children? Well, Eliza Georgina Hague, she died of consumption in 1856. James Hague Jr., he went to live with Mary's brother, Angus Crawford, at Springvale Farm in Coburg, sometime before his father died. We're not sure when. But there he married his cousin, Laura Isabella Crawford, in 1864, and they had 2 children, Laura Isabella Georgina in 1865, Patrick Templeton Hague in 67. But tragically, on June the 8th, 1868, James Hague died at only 825. He died. His burial record says heart disease, but the Peterborough Examiner says discharge of a pistol, the contents of which passed through his left breast. Well, lead poisoning. Anyway, the Examiner article said they were awaiting further news, but I didn't find any further news. So, with his wife and children were at the time and continued to live with Angus Crawford at the Springvale Farm near Coburg. Now, what was going on back in Durham? Susanna Moody writes to her husband John in March of '39, Sam Strickland is going to take the Selby Mills on a 20-year lease to rebuild them in 3 others. Now, of course, the Selby Mills, these, of course, were the Lakefield mills that the Harriet brothers had built in about 1833. They started in 1833. They got into financial difficulties, and the mills were taken over by another gentleman. I have by James Thompson. But then he also got into financial difficulties, and he put the mills and the water rights up for sale in June 1838. So Sam has decided he's going to take them on. So the next thing we hear is that about 1846, Sam Strickland and his brother-in-law John Reed, who is also the county engineer, they construct a new dam at Lakefield. And we're told that the water level of Lake Catchwanuka was raised by 43 inches. This is the normal summertime flow. That's quite a bit of water. And that resulted in permanent flooding of much land. which would have created Hague's Point and the Lakefield Marsh. Now, if we look on this modern navigation map, you can get an idea from the water depths and whatnot where the probable summertime shoreline was before the dam raised up. And you can see that all the land which is now the marsh was probably low ground, but it may have got flooded in the spring, but it was still there. It was probably usable for pasture and that kind of thing. So Laura and James Hague, they were heirs to the Hague Point land. First of all, James Hague. In those days, wives didn't inherit. So when James Hague, the original James Hague, died, his youngest son, who was born 2 weeks anyway, after he died, he actually inherited because he was the oldest son. And then when he died, his two children were the heirs. So Angus Crawford, their grandfather, he decided he would, on their behalf, he would sue the businessman who had profited from the use of the dam that caused the flooding of Hague's property. And this is the names of the men who were named in the lawsuit. So we don't know quite when the lawsuit was put in place, but in March of 1844, the case was settled by the Ontario Court of Chancery, and they said, whereas there is in contemplation or may now be in process of construction certain work of Dominion Canada, the Trent Canal or so on, the Crown would pay compensation to anybody around the lake who had lost land due to flooding. And the Hague children, in particular, they received $2,000. So it seems quite certain that none of the original Hague family occupied Hague's Point land, either before or after James Hague's death in 1843. Our own Lakefield history book, Nelson Spalt's Lakefield, says that it was a favorite camping ground of the Anishinaabe during the last half of the 19th century. Over the years, the Hague, the Smith Lot 28, Concession 8, was sold, bits of it were sold by the Hague children. The county of Peterborough, there's a tiny little corner of it down here, which is part of the lot. That was bought by the county for the bridge going across. And then in about 1902, some of this land around through which Danecourt, in that area, that was sold. J.E. White was one name, and I think there were others. And then finally, in 1911, the then town of Lakefield bought all the rest of the lot, particularly the Hague. I'm not sure whether this is all marsh now, I guess, but they bought this part for the park that we know today. So our history book, as they say, has a short chapter with all kinds of information about Hague's Point, a little bit before, but primarily since then. And I'm not going to cover any of that now, but I encourage you to read it. So finally, I just want to say a little about Walter Crawford's descendants. Charles Crawford was another son of Walter Crawford, and he farmed in Smith and then in Durrow. His farm in Smith originally was one of Walter Crawford's properties. It was, you see, Smith, it was the south half of, or south part of lots 27 and 28 in concession 6. This is on the, it was on the river, south of Lakefield, just about opposite the Sawyers Creek property. And And when Augustus Sawyers moved to Peterborough in the 1850s, Charles moved across to the Sawyers Creek property, and the Smith farm was sold to the Hetherington family. In the mid-1880s, Charles and at least one of his sons, Charles Jr., moved to a house on Catherine Street, and Charles Sr. Died there in 1905 at the age of 81. Our history books tell us that Charles Jr. and later his son Theodore Crawford operated a store on Bridge Street for a great many years. One of the Lakefield war veterans that our society has written up was James Scott Crawford, and he was a great-great-grandson of Walter Crawford. Now also in the Trent Valley Archives, a few years ago, a lady named Hazel Croft, who was Hazel Crawford before she was married, she had a collection of old photographs of Crawford family members, and these were donated by her children to the Trent Valley Archives, and you can actually go there. Here, these are two that were published in the Heritage Gazette back in November 2017. One is Richard J. Crawford, who was a child of the earlier Charles Crawford, and grandson, of course, of Walter, and then his son, Frederick, who was Hazel Crawford's father. So there we are. I'm very interested in talking to any of the Crawford residents. I hope that I've been able to tell you some things you didn't already know about your family. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try and answer them. It's actually taken off the internet. It's a picture taken by a lady named Pat Jilson, and it is the viewing tower in the Lakefield Marsh. It must have been taken a few years ago, because I think the viewing tower must have been taken shortly after it was built. It's looking pretty good there. I believe it's being restored now. Yes. Okay. So, questions? Excuse me, I've got conversations going and I can't hear. I tell you what, we have a microphone, which I think we can turn on here. Yep. Why don't you ask? There you are.
If you're going west on the Bridge North Road, and you go past the center line, and past the center line, and on the south there's a sizable marsh.
Oh yeah.
Now, if you're driving along there, you come to a spot where going to the southwest, there's like a row of trees, that there was a railroad or something through there at one time. Does anybody know anything about that?
Yeah. Well, you're talking Miller Creek that runs all through, almost from Bridge North all the way down through Smith Township and enters Lake Machimanuka about halfway up, and it crosses the Lakefield to Bridge North Road just about Center Road. It's just a little bit north of Center Road. I think that's the creek here and swampy area you're talking about. But
You're driving along, going west.
Going west towards Bridge North, yeah.
And the big marsh on the south side of the road. And you're getting quite a piece over on it, and straight as an arrow.
Oh, yeah.
There was a roadway there, it's all grown up with trees, but it's marsh on each side. And I'm thinking, nobody built
I'm not aware of any railroad that was built through there. Anyone have any ideas on that?
There's a little white house across the road from it.
I think so.
And the train used to go from Peterborough across and up in behind, and that's where the station for the railroad was, up on
Wow.
Swan
It was a
Way.
railroad.
And the people that are living in there now know all about it. If you're interested in it, you can
And where
ask
did
them.
the rail?
They're selling eggs and chickens and,
Excellent. Wow, okay.
Do you know where the track went to?
it goes through the swamp on the other side, but it goes up between on the high ground.
It was the Peterborough to Bridge North.
Railroad.
Yeah, there was a, they did
Was
build a
one, there
railway
was.
there at one time. Yeah. Okay, good. Oops, sorry. Any other questions? Wow, that was easy. Yeah. Well, no, that's just in case.
Well, that was very interesting and informative. I learned a lot tonight, and I hope you did too. I'd like to thank Mike for putting that together and putting such a nice presentation together. On behalf of the Historical Society, I'd just like to give you this little token of appreciation. Thank you. And you probably know when you came in tonight, you got a ticket for a little door prize, and I'm going to call Sharon Clancy forward to make the draw and see who our lucky winner is. Jerry Sullivan.
Why? 8172014.
I think Elizabeth Crawford is our winner tonight. So I just wanted to let you know that our next meeting will be May 30th. And we hope to have our good friend Woody Farrell is going to come and give us a bit of history on how he got involved with metal sculpturing, something like that, and what was involved, and maybe share some pictures with us, and maybe more. So I'd like you to come and hear what he has to say next month. I think now we can maybe adjourn the meeting, and you can socialize and have some tea, cookies, whatever. Thank you.